these ancient teachings dissolve the endless chatter of your mind and guide you into the profound stillness that has always been your true nature. Tonight, as you settle into rest, I invite you to share where you are listening from. Type your city or country in the comments below, and know that across this vast world, others are joining you in this journey toward inner quiet. Here, there is nothing to figure out, nothing to solve, no puzzle to complete. The wisdom we explore tonight is not found in thinking more clearly, but in learning to stop thinking altogether. These Zen stories point toward what the masters call no mind, that spacious awareness before thought arises, where peace lives not as something you achieve, but as what you already are beneath the noise. Simply breathe, release, and let these tales wash over you like water over stones, smoothing away what was never needed. Let us begin. For thousands of years, Zen masters have taught that our suffering comes not from our circumstances, but from our constant thinking about our circumstances. The mind that never stops analyzing, planning, worrying, judging. This is what the Zen tradition calls monkey mind, always jumping from branch to branch, never at rest. But there is another possibility, another way of being that the masters discovered and passed down through generations. They called it mushin no mind, not the absence of consciousness, but the presence of pure awareness without the interference of thought. This no-mind state is not something foreign or mystical. You've experienced it, though perhaps without recognizing it. It's the state you enter when completely absorbed in music, when time disappears during a perfect conversation, when your body moves without conscious direction during a familiar task. In those moments, thinking stops, and something more immediate takes over, a direct experiencing of life without the filter of mental commentary. The challenge is that we've become addicted to thinking. We believe that more thinking will solve our problems, that analyzing will bring clarity, that if we just figure it out, we'll find peace. But Zen teaches something radical. The mind that's trying to solve the problem is the problem. The peace we're seeking exists in the gap between thoughts, in the silence underneath the mental noise, in the space we can only access by letting thinking fall away. There was a software engineer named Michael who lived in the bustling tech center of Austin, Texas, USA. His work demanded constant problem solving, strategic thinking, technical analysis. Michael was brilliant at it. His mind could hold complex systems, see patterns others missed, debug code that baffled his colleagues. He'd built his entire career on the power of his analytical mind, and it had served him well. But it had also become a prison he didn't know he was trapped in. Michael's mind never stopped, even away from work, even during vacations, even lying in bed at night. His thoughts ran continuously, planning, analyzing, replaying conversations, solving problems that didn't exist yet, worrying about outcomes he couldn't control. He'd wake at 3 a.m. with his mind already racing through his to-do list. He'd sit at dinner with friends while his thoughts were somewhere else entirely, planning his next project or rehashing a difficult meeting. He tried meditation apps, downloaded sleep programs, read books about mindfulness. They all said the same thing: observe your thoughts without judgment, return to your breath, to be present. But the more Michael tried to quiet his mind, the louder it seemed to become. The more he thought about not thinking, the more thinking happened. He was using his problem-solving mind to try to solve the problem of having a problem-solving mind. And it was like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. One weekend, burned out, and desperate for something different. Michael drove to a Zen center he'd heard about in the hill country outside Austin. He had no expectations, just a vague hope that maybe these people who'd been practicing meditation for years might have figured something out that the apps couldn't teach him. The teacher that weekend was an American Zen monk named Jiro, who'd trained in Japan for 15 years before returning to teach in the States. He was younger than Michael expected, maybe late 40s, with an easiness about him that seemed at odds with the rigorous discipline Michael associated with Zen practice. During the first meditation session, Michael did what he always did. He tried very hard to meditate correctly. He focused intensely on his breath, noted his thoughts meticulously, worked diligently to be present. After 30 minutes, he was more tense than when he'd started, and his mind felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. In the question period afterward, Michael raised his hand. "I can't stop thinking," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "I try to focus on my breath, but within seconds, my mind is somewhere else. I try to be present, but I'm immediately lost in thought. How do I make my mind stop?" Jiro smiled, not a mocking smile, but one of recognition and perhaps affection. "You can't," he said simply. Michael blinked, confused. "But isn't that the whole point? To quiet the mind?" "No," Jiro said. "That's what everyone thinks Zen is about. But it's a misunderstanding. You can't make the mind stop thinking any more than you can make the heart stop beating or the lungs stop breathing. The mind's nature is to produce thoughts. That's just what it does." He stood up and walked to the window, gesturing outside. "See that creek running past the meditation hall? Can you make the water stop flowing? Can you force it to be still?" "No," Michael said. "Right. But does the creek's flowing disturb you? Does it create suffering?" "No." "Why not?" Michael thought about this. "Because I'm not identified with it. I'm not trying to control it. I just let it be what it is." "Exactly," Jiro said, his eyes bright. "Thoughts are like that creek. They flow. That's their nature. Your suffering doesn't come from having thoughts. It comes from believing you're supposed to stop them, from trying to control them, from identifying with them as my thoughts that you're responsible for managing." He sat back down. The practice of Zen is not to stop thinking. It's to stop being hypnotized by thinking. To recognize thoughts as just another sensory experience, like sounds or sensations arising and passing, coming and going, all on their own without your management. Over that weekend, Jiro taught Michael a different approach. Instead of trying to stop thoughts or push them away or even observe them mindfully, he taught what he called radical allowing. Just let thoughts be there. Don't try to meditate. Don't try to be present. Don't try to do anything at all. Just sit and let your experience be whatever it is thinking. Stillness, boredom, peace, frustration, whatever shows up. The trying is the problem, Jiro explained. Every time you try to quiet your mind, you're actually engaging the mind more. You're creating a project for the mind to work on. And the mind loves projects. It will happily spend hours trying to become a mind that doesn't think, which is absurd when you consider it. Michael found this approach profoundly disorienting at first. His entire life had been built on trying, on effort, on making things happen through mental force. To just sit and allow whatever was happening without trying to fix it or improve it or achieve some state, it felt like giving up, like failure. But he tried it anyway. He sat in the meditation hall and let himself think. Planning thoughts came, he let them come. Worrying thoughts arose, he let them arise. Analyzing, judging, fantasizing, all of it allowed to be there without resistance. And something unexpected happened. When Michael stopped fighting his thoughts, when he stopped trying to push them away or manage them, they began to lose their grip. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually. The thoughts were still there, but they felt more like background noise than urgent demands requiring his attention. It was like the difference between being caught in a rainstorm and watching rain through a window. The rain was the same, but the relationship to it completely different. Michael was still thinking, his mind hadn't suddenly become quiet, but he was no longer drowning in the thoughts. There was space around them, awareness that held the thoughts without being consumed by them. On the last evening of the retreat, Jiro shared a teaching that Michael would return to again and again in the years that followed. In Zen, we have a saying, when hungry, eat. When tired, sleep. This sounds obvious, but watch yourself carefully. When you eat, are you actually eating? Or are you thinking about eating? Planning the next bite? Judging whether it's good? Worrying about calories? Mentally reviewing your day? When you sleep, are you actually sleeping? Or are you thinking about sleeping? Trying to make yourself sleep? Worrying that you're not sleeping well enough? He paused, letting this land. No mind doesn't mean your mind becomes empty and stays empty. It means you eat when you eat, without thinking about eating. You walk when you walk, without narrating the walking. You work when you work, fully engaged, without the constant mental commentary about your working. The mind is still functioning. You can think when thinking is needed, but it's not running continuously in the background like a motor that never shuts off. Michael returned home changed, though not in the dramatic way he'd hoped for. His mind didn't suddenly become peaceful. Thoughts still arose constantly, but he'd learned to have a different relationship with them. When planning, thoughts appeared, he could recognize, planning thoughts. When worry arose, he could notice, worry is here, not as problems to solve, but as weather patterns moving through awareness. The real shift came in daily life. Michael found he could write code with total absorption, his hands moving across the keyboard while his analytical mind worked without his conscious direction. He'd finish a complex debugging session and realize hours had passed without any sense of time, without the usual running commentary about how it was going or whether he was doing it right. This was no mind, not absence of thought, but absence of the thinker, separate from the thinking. In meetings, he could listen to colleagues without his mind constantly preparing his response or judging what they were saying. He could be with friends at dinner and actually be there, present for the conversation, the laughter, the connection not lost in his own mental world. His girlfriend noticed the change. "You're actually here now," she said one evening. "Before, I felt like I was competing with whatever was happening in your head. But lately, when we're together, you're really with me." Michael still had an active mind that hadn't changed and never would, but the relationship had transformed. The mind was no longer his master, demanding constant attention and obedience. It had become what it was always meant to be, a useful tool that he could pick up when needed and put down when not. Breathe deeply now, and notice the space between your thoughts. They're just there in the gap before the next thought forms. That's no mind, not something you have to achieve or create, just the natural spaciousness that's always present. the awareness that was here before this thought and will be here after it passes. The teaching Michael discovered points to something essential. We are not our thoughts. We are the awareness in which thoughts appear and disappear. But we've become so hypnotized by the content of our thinking that we've forgotten the awareness itself, the silent, spacious, ever-present backdrop against which all experience unfolds. This forgetting creates most of our suffering. We believe our thoughts about things are the same as the things themselves. We think our mental narrative about our life is our actual life. We're so busy thinking about experience that we miss the direct experiencing itself. It's like watching a movie and becoming so absorbed in the plot that we forget we're sitting in a theater. Forget the screen on which the images appear. Forget the space that holds it all. Zen practice is remembering, not adding something new, but recognizing what was always already here. This awareness, this presence, this no mind that exists before and underneath all the thinking. In the creative district of Montreal, Quebec, Canada, there lived a painter named Sophie, whose struggle was different from Michael's, but emerged from the same root. Sophie had studied art at the finest schools, learned technique and theory, could discuss conceptual frameworks and artistic movements with impressive sophistication. Her mind was highly trained, sharp, analytical, but somewhere along the way, she'd lost the ability to actually paint. She could stand before a canvas for hours, paralyzed by her own thinking. Every brushstroke was preceded by analysis. What does this color choice mean? How does this composition relate to contemporary discourse? Is this authentic or derivative? Her inner critic had become so loud, so relentless, that the spontaneous creative flow she'd known as a child had completely disappeared. Sophie's studio was filled with half-finished canvases, abandoned when her thinking mind declared them inadequate or confused or not meaningful enough. She'd start with enthusiasm, but within minutes, the mental commentary would begin its assault, and the joy would drain away, replaced by anxiety and self-doubt. One evening, after another frustrating day of staring at blank canvas while her mind spun in circles, Sophie walked to a small Zen temple in her neighborhood. She wasn't particularly interested in Buddhism. She'd gone there only because they offered free meditation sessions, and she was desperate for something, anything, that might quiet the noise in her head. The teacher was an elderly woman named Sensei Marie, a French-Canadian who trained in Japan for 20 years before returning to teach in Montreal. The meditation hall was simple, unadorned, just white walls, wooden floors, black cushions arranged in neat rows. Sit, Sensei Marie said simply. No instructions about posture or breath or technique. Just sit. Sophie sat, and immediately her mind began its familiar pattern, judging whether she was sitting correctly, wondering what she was supposed to be doing, analyzing the experience, comparing it to meditation she'd read about. After 30 minutes of this mental chaos, she felt more agitated than when she'd started. When the session ended, Sophie approached Sensei Marie with frustration. I can't do this. My mind won't stop. I'm not good at meditation. Sensei Marie laughed, a genuine, warm laugh that surprised Sophie. Good at meditation? She repeated. That's your problem right there. You're trying to be good at it. You're making it into a performance, something to achieve or fail at. But meditation is not a skill to master. It's a letting go of the need to master anything. She gestured for Sophie to walk with her in the small garden behind the temple. They walked in silence for a few minutes before Sensei Marie spoke again. You're a painter. Yes, I can see the paint on your hands. Sophie nodded, surprised she'd noticed. Tell me, when you were a child, did you think about painting? Or did you just paint? The question stopped Sophie in her tracks. She remembered being 7 or 8 years old, lying on her stomach on the kitchen floor with paper and crayons spread around her, completely absorbed for hours. No thoughts about whether she was doing it right. No analysis of meaning or technique. Just color and form and the pure joy of creating. I just painted, Sophie said quietly. Exactly, Sensei Marie said. That's no mind. That's what we call mushin in Japanese, the mind that acts without thinking about acting. You've lost that. You've replaced direct experience with constant analysis. Your thinking mind has taken over completely, and it's strangling your creativity. Word count to 700. Over the following weeks, Sophie returned to the temple regularly. Not because meditation was helping her paint, it wasn't. At least not in any obvious way, but because Sensei Marie's presence intrigued her. The old woman moved through the temple with an ease that Sophie had never seen, doing simple tasks like sweeping or preparing tea with complete absorption. There was no sense of someone performing tasks while thinking about other things. Just sweeping, just tea, just this. One morning, Sophie arrived early and found Sensei Marie doing calligraphy in the meditation hall. She was painting a single character on a large piece of rice paper, and what struck Sophie was the quality of presence in the act. Sensei Marie's brush moved across the paper with fluidity and decisiveness, no hesitation, no second guessing, no mental interruption between intention and action. When she finished, Sensei Marie looked up and smiled. This is how we train no mind in Zen, she said, gesturing to the calligraphy. The brush must move before the thinking mind can interfere. If I think about how to make the stroke, by the time the thought completes, the moment for that stroke has passed. The brush must move from emptiness, from no mind, or the character becomes dead. She invited Sophie to try. Sophie picked up the brush, dipped it in ink, and immediately her thinking mind activated. How should I hold this? What character should I paint? What if I mess up this expensive paper? She froze, brush hovering above the paper. You're thinking, Sensei Marie observed. Put down the brush. Sophie put it down, confused. The problem is not your skill or technique. The problem is the gap between intention and action. Your thinking mind lives in that gap. It analyzes, judges, hesitates. By the time your mind has finished its commentary, the spontaneous impulse is gone. You must learn to close that gap, to move from intention to action so quickly that thinking has no time to interfere. She handed Sophie a different brush, smaller and less intimidating. Paint a circle, not a good circle or a perfect circle. Just move the brush in a circular motion. Don't think, don't plan, just move. Sophie tried. Her hand moved, creating a lopsided, uneven circle. Her mind immediately began its critique. That's terrible. So imperfect. A child could do better. Again, Sensei Marie said, faster this time. Don't look at what you made. Just make another. Sophie painted another circle, and another, and another. Sensei Marie kept saying, again, faster. Don't think. After maybe 20 circles, something shifted. Sophie's hand was moving on its own, creating circles without her conscious direction. The thinking mind, unable to keep up with the rapid repetition, had finally quieted. She was just circling. No judgment, no analysis, just the brush moving, the ink flowing, the present moment unfolding without interference. She looked up at Sensei Marie with surprise. "There," the old woman said. "That's no mind. That's what you knew as a child. That's what you need to find again. Not just in this practice, but in your painting. The mind that acts without thinking about acting." Sophie began practicing calligraphy every morning before going to her studio. Not to become good at calligraphy, Sensei Marie was clear that achievement wasn't the point, but to train the muscle of no mind. To strengthen her capacity to move from intention to action without the thinking mind's interference. Gradually, subtly, this practice began affecting her painting. Sophie would stand before her canvas, brush in hand, and instead of thinking about what to paint, she would simply make a mark. Then another, not from a plan or concept, but from a more immediate place, from feeling, from intuition, from something that moved faster than thought. The paintings that emerged were different from anything she'd made before. They weren't better in a technical sense, if anything. They were rougher, less polished, but they had a vitality, an aliveness that her previous work had lacked. They felt painted rather than constructed, created rather than manufactured. Her dealer visited the studio and was stunned. "What happened?" she asked, looking at the new canvases. "These are completely different. I don't know how to describe it. They feel more immediate, more alive." Sophie tried to explain about Zen, about no mind, about learning to paint without thinking, but it sounded abstract even to her own ears. How do you put into words the experience of getting out of your own way? How do you describe the difference between making art from your thinking mind versus from something deeper and more immediate? One evening, working on a large canvas, Sophie experienced something she'd only read about before. Her hand was moving across the canvas, making marks, mixing colors, applying paint, but there was no sense of Sophie doing it. The painting was painting itself through her. Her thinking mind was completely absent. Time disappeared. Self-consciousness vanished. There was just painting happening, just creative energy flowing without obstruction. When she finally stepped back hours later, though it felt like minutes, she had no idea if what she'd created was good or bad. That judgment belonged to the thinking mind, and the thinking mind hadn't been present. She just knew that she'd experienced what Sensei Marie had been pointing toward: no mind. Mushin, the state before thinking arises, where everything flows naturally, without interference. That painting sold for more than anything she'd ever created. Critics called it raw and immediate and alive with presence. But Sophie knew the secret. It was good precisely because she hadn't been trying to make it good. She'd simply gotten out of the way and let something flow through her that was deeper and wiser than her thinking mind could ever be. Breathe slowly now, feeling your body settle into stillness. Notice how breath happens on its own, without thinking about it. This is no mind, your body's wisdom that acts without mental interference. Can you extend that same trust to the rest of your experience? Can you let life unfold without the constant mental management? The teaching Sophie discovered is available to all of us, not just in creative work, but in every aspect of living. The thinking mind is a beautiful tool for certain tasks: planning, analyzing, solving technical problems. But we've made it our master, letting it run continuously, applying it to experiences where it creates more problems than it solves. When we're in conversation, we don't need to be thinking about what to say next while the other person is still speaking. When we're walking, we don't need to narrate the experience of walking. When we're eating, we don't need to analyze every flavor. These activities have their own intelligence, their own flow, and they function better when the thinking mind steps back and lets them happen naturally. The Zen masters understood this deeply. They developed practices, meditation, archery, calligraphy, tea ceremony, gardening not as skills to master, but as doorways into no mind, ways of training ourselves to act without the interference of thought, to be present without the filter of mental commentary, to live from a deeper intelligence than the thinking mind can access. What they discovered, and what modern neuroscience is now confirming, is that the thinking mind is actually quite slow and limited. It can only hold a few things in working memory at once. It processes information sequentially, one thought after another. But underneath that slow, sequential thinking is a much faster, more sophisticated intelligence. The intelligence that allows us to recognize faces instantly, to navigate complex social situations intuitively, to perform learned skills without conscious direction. This deeper intelligence is what the Zen tradition calls Buddha nature or original mind. It's not something we need to develop or achieve. It's already here, already functioning, already perfect. We just need to stop obscuring it with constant thinking. Next is our third story. But before I tell you, smash that like button and subscribe to show some love. It means the world to me. In the academic town of Oxford, England, UK, there was a philosophy professor named William who had spent 30 years studying consciousness, mind, and awareness. He'd read everything Western philosophy, cognitive science, Buddhist texts, neuroscience, research. His mind was a vast library of knowledge about the nature of mind. But as he approached his 60th birthday, William realized something troubling. Despite decades of studying consciousness, he had never actually examined his own consciousness directly. He knew what Descartes said, what Kant argued, what contemporary philosophers debated, but he had never simply sat down and looked at his own mind without the mediation of concepts and theories. This realization disturbed him more than he wanted to admit. He'd built an entire career on thinking about thinking, but he'd never stopped thinking long enough to see what awareness itself was like without thought. It was like being a food critic who'd read every cookbook and restaurant review, but had never actually tasted anything directly. Word count to 4,000. William decided to take a sabbatical, something he'd never done in his entire academic career. He told colleagues he was writing a book, which wasn't entirely untrue. But the real reason was simpler and more desperate. He needed to find out if there was anything beyond the thinking mind, or if consciousness was nothing but an endless stream of thoughts about thoughts about thoughts. He found a Zen monastery in the countryside outside Oxford that offered month-long silent retreats for serious practitioners. The teacher, a British monk named Ajahn Robert, who'd ordained in Thailand 40 years earlier, interviewed William before accepting him. "Why do you want to come here?" Ajahn Robert asked. William launched into an articulate explanation about the limitations of purely intellectual approaches to consciousness, about the need for phenomenological investigation alongside theoretical analysis, about bridging the gap between third-person and first-person perspectives on mind. Ajahn Robert listened patiently, then said something that stopped William cold. "That's a very clever answer, but it's all thinking. I asked why you want to come here, and you gave me 10 minutes of thought. Can you answer without thinking?" William opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no idea how to answer without thinking. Every response that arose was a thought. The question itself seemed impossible. "That's why you're here," Ajahn Robert said kindly, "to discover what's here when thinking stops. Not to think about what might be here, but to actually experience it directly. Can you do that?" "I don't know," William admitted. "Good," Ajahn Robert said. "Not knowing is an excellent place to start. Welcome." The retreat was unlike anything William had experienced. No talking, no reading, no writing activities. He'd used his entire life to process experience through thinking. Just sitting meditation for hours each day. Walking meditation. Simple work tasks done in silence. At first, William's mind went into overdrive, generating thoughts at a furious pace. Without his usual outlets for thinking, conversation, reading, writing, the thoughts just circulated endlessly inside his head like water that couldn't drain. He thought about his research, about students, about papers he needed to write, about conversations from years ago, about what he'd eat for lunch, about whether he was meditating correctly, about the nature of the thinking that was noticing he was thinking about whether he was meditating correctly. On and on, layer upon layer of metacognition, thinking in an infinite regress. After a week of this mental chaos, William approached Ajahn Robert during a brief interview period. "My mind won't stop," he said. "I've been meditating for 7 days, and if anything, it's gotten worse. The thoughts are constant, relentless. I can't find any gap, any space." "Is this normal?" Ajahn Robert smiled. "Completely normal. You've spent 60 years training your mind to think constantly. Now you're asking it to stop. Of course it's resisting, but you're making a fundamental mistake." "What's that?" "You're trying to stop thinking." That's another thought, another mental project. The mind trying to stop the mind. It doesn't work. It's like trying to wash blood off your hands with blood. William frowned, confused. "So what should I do?" "Nothing." Ajahn Robert said, "Don't try to stop thinking. Don't try to be present. Don't try to achieve no mind. Just sit. Let the thinking happen. Let it be as loud and chaotic as it wants to be. You're not trying to control it or change it. You're just watching it, like watching clouds pass across the sky." "But I am watching it," William protested. "I'm constantly aware of my thoughts." "That's the problem. I can't stop being aware of them." "Ah," Ajahn Robert said, his eyes brightening. "Now we're getting somewhere. You can't stop being aware of thoughts." "Why?" William thought about this, then caught himself. "I'm thinking about your question." "Yes, but underneath the thinking, what's already here? What's aware of the thoughts?" William sat with this, and for just a moment, a brief gap between thoughts, he sensed something. Not a thing, exactly, but a quality of awareness that was present even when thoughts weren't. It was like the background hum he'd never noticed because the foreground noise was so loud. But in that momentary gap, the background became foreground, and he saw it, awareness itself, empty and spacious. within which thoughts arose and passed like clouds in a vast sky. The seeing lasted maybe 2 seconds before thinking rushed back in to claim it, analyze it, understand it. But those 2 seconds changed everything. William had touched something that all his years of studying consciousness had never revealed: the direct experience of awareness without thought. Not thinking about awareness, but awareness, aware of itself. Over the remaining weeks of the retreat, William stopped trying to achieve anything. He just sat. Sometimes thinking happened. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes there were long stretches of no mind, vast and peaceful. Sometimes his mind was a tornado of thoughts. He stopped judging any of it as good or bad, successful or failing. He just watched it all arise and pass in the space of awareness that was always already here, always already untouched by whatever content moved through it. Near the end of the retreat, during a particularly deep meditation, William's entire sense of being a separate self dissolved. There was no William sitting in meditation. There was just sitting, just breathing, just awareness, being aware of itself. No subject experiencing an object. No observer watching the observed. Just experience, experiencing itself. Thought-free, immediate, complete. When he returned to Oxford and his academic life, William was profoundly changed. He still thought his work required it, and he was still brilliant at it. But thinking was no longer continuous. He could think when needed, then put thought down like a tool when it wasn't needed. And in the gaps between thinking, there was something he'd never known before: peace. Not the peace that comes from resolving problems or achieving goals, but the peace that's always already here underneath the noise. The peace that doesn't depend on anything being any particular way. His teaching changed too. William began incorporating meditation into his philosophy courses, teaching students not just to think about consciousness, but to investigate it directly. Some colleagues thought he'd lost his edge, gone soft, become less rigorous. But his students reported something different. For the first time, philosophy felt alive, relevant, connected to their actual experience rather than just abstract theorizing. One student asked him what he'd discovered during his retreat. William was quiet for a long moment before answering. I discovered that everything I'd been studying for 30 years, consciousness, awareness, the mind was right here all along, closer than my own breath. I'd been looking for it in books and theories, in other people's ideas, when it was the very thing doing the looking. You can't find awareness by thinking about it, because awareness is what makes thinking possible. It's prior to thought. It's what's here when thought stops. And it's been here your entire life, waiting for you to notice it. Let your awareness rest now in itself, not going anywhere, not seeking anything, just being what it already is. Notice that you don't have to create awareness, it's already here. You don't have to achieve presence, you're already present. You don't have to find no mind, it's the natural state that exists in every gap between thoughts. The teaching William discovered through direct experience is what Zen has been pointing to for centuries. We are not our thoughts. We are the awareness in which thoughts appear. But we've become so identified with thinking that we've forgotten the awareness itself, the silent, spacious, ever-present ground of being that was here before you, learned language, before you developed a sense of self, before thought arose to claim ownership of experience. This forgetting is what creates our suffering. We believe we are the thinker, the doer, the one who must manage and control everything, through mental effort. But this belief is itself just another thought. And when we see through it, when we recognize the awareness that exists prior to and independent of thought, we discover a freedom that thinking can never provide. This is why Zen training is often misunderstood. People think it's about achieving some special state, becoming enlightened, or developing supernatural abilities. But the Zen masters teach something much simpler and more immediate. Just stop. Stop trying. Stop seeking. Stop even trying to stop. Rest in the awareness that's already here. That's been here all along. That doesn't need to be created or improved or achieved. The challenge is that our entire culture trains us to do the opposite. We're taught that more effort brings better results, that thinking harder solves problems, that achievement requires constant striving, and in many areas of life, this is true. But when it comes to discovering our true nature, when it comes to finding the peace that exists beneath the mental noise, effort is the obstacle, not the solution. The harder we try to be present, the more we're trapped in the trying. The more we seek no mind, the more the seeking mind dominates. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The very instrument you're using to look is what you're trying to see. So the Zen approach is paradoxical. Achieve by not trying to achieve. Find by stopping the search. Become what you already are by dropping the need to become anything. This paradox confounded rational minds for centuries, which is why Zen masters developed teaching methods that bypass logic entirely, koans that break the thinking mind, unexpected shouts and strikes that interrupt thought, silence that points beyond words. They understood that the thinking mind cannot think its way to no mind. It can only exhaust itself trying until it finally gives up. And in that giving up, what was always already here reveals itself. The next teaching arrives for those whose greatest strength has become their greatest prison, people whose brilliant analytical minds serve them professionally but trap them in every other area of life. In the harbour city of Auckland, New Zealand, there was a corporate lawyer named James who lived his life by logic, analysis, and strategic thinking. His work demanded it contracts, negotiations, legal arguments, all required precise mental acuity. James was exceptional at what he did, commanding high fees for his ability to think through complex situations and find solutions others missed. But this same sharp mind that served him so well professionally had become a burden in every other area of his life. James couldn't turn it off. Every interaction was analyzed. Every decision required extensive mental deliberation. Every experience was immediately filtered through layers of thought and interpretation. His wife Emma had been patient for years, but she'd finally reached her limit. "I'm tired of competing with your thoughts for your attention," she told him one evening after he'd spent an entire dinner clearly somewhere else mentally. "I feel like you're never actually here with me. You're always in your head, solving problems that don't exist, planning conversations before they happen, analyzing everything to death." James tried to defend himself. He was a lawyer. Thinking was what he did, but he knew she was right. He'd become so identified with his thinking mind that he'd lost the ability to simply be present for life as it unfolded. Everything was mediated by thought, analyzed, conceptualized, never directly experienced. A colleague mentioned that a Zen teacher from Japan was visiting Auckland for a week-long intensive workshop. James normally dismissed such things as impractical mysticism, but Emma's words had shaken him enough that he signed up, half hoping the teacher could give him some mental technique to quiet his overactive mind. The teacher, Roshi Tanaka, was an elderly Japanese man who spoke minimal English and taught primarily through demonstration rather than explanation. The first session consisted of nothing but sitting in silence for 40 minutes. No instructions, no guided meditation, no explanation of what they were supposed to be doing, just sitting. James's mind went into overdrive immediately. What was he supposed to be doing? Was there a technique he should be following? Should he focus on his breath, clear his mind? What was the goal here? His thinking mind, encountering no clear problem to solve, began generating problems to keep itself busy. After the sitting, Roshi Tanaka asked if anyone had questions. James raised his hand. What exactly are we trying to accomplish? What's the technique? Roshi Tanaka looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through his question. No technique, he said simply. No accomplish. Just sit. But there must be something I should be doing. James pressed. Some way to do it correctly. Roshi Tanaka smiled. You want to be good at sitting, like being good at sleeping. How do you be good at sleeping? James opened his mouth to answer, then realized the absurdity. You can't try to sleep. Trying is what prevents sleep. You can only create conditions for sleep and then let go. Sitting is same. Roshi Tanaka said, cannot try, can only allow. Over the following days, James struggled profoundly with this instruction to not do. His entire life had been built on doing, on effort, on achieving through mental application. To just sit without trying to accomplish anything, without a goal or method or measure of progress, it felt like failure, like giving up. On the third day, during a sitting session, James's frustration peaked. He'd been sitting for 30 minutes and his mind hadn't quieted at all. Thoughts were as loud and constant as ever. He felt like he was failing at meditation, which made him even more agitated, which created more thoughts in an endless spiral. In that moment of complete frustration, something in James gave up, not consciously, not as a strategy, but as a genuine collapse of effort. He stopped trying to meditate, stopped trying to quiet his mind, stopped trying to be present or achieve no mind or do anything at all. He just sat there, defeated, not even trying anymore. And in that moment of genuine surrender, when the trying finally ceased, a gap appeared, a space between thoughts. Just for a second or two, the constant mental noise stopped, and there was nothing. Not nothing as in emptiness or void, but nothing as in no thought, just pure awareness, alert and clear, without any mental content. The gap closed almost immediately, thinking rushed back in to claim the experience, analyze it, try to recreate it. But James had tasted something he'd never known in his entire life, a moment of consciousness without thought, direct awareness without the filter of mental commentary. That evening, Roshi Tanaka gave a brief talk. Thinking is like breathing, he said through his translator. Natural function of mind. Cannot stop breathing by trying. Can only hold breath for short time, then must breathe again. Same with thinking. Cannot stop thinking by trying, but between breaths, there is pause. Between thoughts, there is gap. This gap is no mind, not created, already there, always there, just usually not noticed because too busy with thoughts. He paused, letting this settle. Practice is not to create no mind, is to notice no mind that's already present. To see the gap, to rest in the pause, not as achievement, not as technique, but as recognition of what's always already here. James understood intellectually, but the real learning came in the days that followed. He stopped trying to meditate correctly and just sat, allowing whatever happened to happen. Sometimes his mind was quiet. More often, it was loud. But he began to notice the gaps, brief moments between thoughts where awareness was present without mental content. At first, these gaps were rare and fleeting, but as he stopped trying to create them and just noticed when they naturally appeared, they became more frequent, more recognizable. On the final day of the intensive, Roshi Tanaka called James forward during a question session. Without warning, he clapped his hands sharply right in front of James's face, a sudden, a loud sound that shocked James into complete presence. In that moment of surprise, before thought could respond, there was just being, awareness, presence, no mind. There, Roshi Tanaka said, smiling, "That is your true face. Face before your parents were born. Face before thinking arose. That is what you are, underneath all the lawyer thoughts." James returned to his law practice, changed in subtle but significant ways. He still thought his work required rigorous analysis, and he remained excellent at it. But thinking was no longer continuous. He discovered he could engage his analytical mind fully during work tasks, then completely disengage it when the task was done. The constant background processing stopped. The endless mental commentary quieted. Emma noticed immediately. "You're actually here," she said one evening, almost crying with relief. "Really here. I can feel it. For the first time in years, when you look at me, I feel seen rather than analyzed." James knew what she meant. He'd stopped filtering his experience through thought. When Emma spoke, he listened from no mind, directly hearing without the mental commentary about what she was saying or planning his response. When they walked together, he was present for the walking rather than lost in planning tomorrow's meetings. When they made love, he was fully there rather than half present, while his mind wandered elsewhere. The irony was that his legal work improved too. When he was working, he could think more clearly because his mind was fresh, not exhausted from running continuously. And he could see angles he'd missed before because he wasn't so caught in his own conceptual frameworks. The gaps between thoughts turned out to be where insights arose, not from more thinking, but from the spacious awareness that existed before and between thoughts. Years later, when other lawyers asked James about his meditation practice, he would say, "I spent 40 years believing I was my thoughts. That thinking was who I was. Then I discovered what every Zen master has been pointing to: you're not your thoughts. You're the space in which thoughts happen." And when you realize that, when you actually see it directly, everything changes. Not because you become someone different, but because you stop pretending to be someone you never were. Breathe slowly now, and notice the space between this breath and the next. In that pause, before the next inhale begins, there is awareness without mental activity. Not trying to be aware, just awareness being what it already is. That's no mind. Not something foreign or mystical, but the most natural thing in the world, closer to you than your own thoughts. The teaching James discovered that we are the awareness prior to thought, not the thoughts themselves, is the foundation of Zen practice. But knowing this intellectually and experiencing it directly are entirely different things. the mind can easily turn even this teaching into another concept to grasp, another idea to believe. The real transformation comes only through direct seeing, through moments when the conceptual mind drops away and we experience awareness, aware of itself, thought-free and complete. This direct seeing often comes not through more effort, but through exhaustion of effort. Not through striving harder, but through finally giving up the struggle. It comes in moments when the seeking stops, when the trying collapses, when we rest in not knowing rather than desperately grasping for understanding. For some, this teaching arrives through the simplest of daily activities, revealing how much we complicate what could be effortless. In the historic city of Dublin, Ireland, there was a chef named Liam who ran a small restaurant known for its creative, ambitious cuisine. Every dish was an elaborate production, multiple components, complex techniques, artistic presentations that looked like sculptures on the plate. Food critics praised his innovation and technical mastery. Liam's ego was deeply invested in this reputation for culinary sophistication. But the truth Liam barely admitted to himself was that cooking had stopped being joyful years ago. Every service was stressful. Every dish a test of whether he could execute at the level his reputation demanded. He'd lie awake planning menus, worrying about reviews, comparing himself to other chefs. His thinking mind had completely taken over what had once been an intuitive, embodied practice. The crisis came during a particularly busy Saturday service. Liam was plating a complex dish, seared scallop with cauliflower 5 ways, edible flowers, a delicate foam, dots of sauce arranged in precise patterns. His mind was running through the checklist, analyzing each element, judging whether it met his standards. In this mental distraction, he knocked over a sauce bottle, which hit a plate, which created a domino effect that destroyed 3 dishes waiting to go out. Liam exploded in rage at himself, at the situation, at the universe for allowing this to happen. His sous chef, a young woman named Ufa, watched with concern. When the service finally ended and the kitchen was clean, she approached him carefully. "Chef, can I say something?" Liam, exhausted and still angry, nodded. "You used to love cooking. I've seen videos of you from 10 years ago. You were smiling, playing with food, having fun. Now you look miserable every service. What happened?" The question hit Liam harder than he expected. What had happened? He'd been successful, gained recognition, raised his standards. But somewhere in that process, he'd lost the thing that made him want to cook in the first place. Aifa hesitated, then continued. "My grandmother runs a tiny noodle shop in Vietnam. Just noodles, nothing fancy. But people come from all over because her noodles are perfect. Not because she thinks about them or analyzes them. She just makes them the same way she's made them for 50 years. Completely present for each step. No ego, no stress. Just making noodles." She pulled out her phone and showed Liam a video of her grandmother working an elderly woman making noodle dough with her hands. Her movements fluid and unself-conscious. A slight smile on her face. There was something about the quality of her presence that stopped Liam cold. She wasn't performing or proving anything. She was just completely absorbed in the simple act of making noodles. She studied Zen Buddhism when she was young. Aoife said, "She always says cooking is meditation. When you make food, you just make food. No thinking about making food. No worrying about whether it's good enough. Just hands moving, ingredients, combining, the complete presence for the task itself. That night, unable to sleep, Liam found himself watching more videos of simple cooking street food vendors in Thailand, home cooks in Italy, grandmothers making traditional recipes passed down for generations. What struck him was the quality of presence in these cooks. They weren't thinking about cooking, they were just cooking. Their bodies moving through familiar motions with an ease and flow that his own cooking had lost. On impulse, Liam decided to try something radical. For 1 week, he would close the restaurant and cook only simple food, not the complex, ambitious dishes that had built his reputation, but basic preparations that required presence rather than technical mastery. The first day, he made bread, just flour, water, salt, yeast. He'd made bread thousands of times, but always as a minor component of some larger dish. Always rushed, always thinking about 10 other things simultaneously. This time, he just made bread, mixed the dough with his hands, feeling the texture change as gluten developed, kneaded without thinking about kneading, just the rhythmic pressing and folding. Let it rise while he sat quietly, not filling the time with other tasks. When he shaped the loaves, his mind tried to jump in with analysis and judgment. Is this the right shape? Is the tension correct? But he noticed this happening and gently returned to just shaping, just feeling the dough respond to his hands. The thinking wasn't necessary. His hands knew what to do from years of experience. He just needed to get out of their way. The bread that came out of the oven was the best he'd made in years. Not because of any special technique or innovation, but because it had been made with complete presence. No mental interference, just bread making itself through him. Over that week, Liam cooked simply roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, rice, basic pasta. Each task became a meditation in no mind. His hands moved without his thinking mind directing them. He tasted without analyzing. He adjusted seasoning from feel rather than calculation. Something profound shifted. Cooking stopped being a performance and became just cooking. The constant mental commentary, is this good enough? Will critics approve? How does this compare to other chefs? All of that quieted. There was just the immediate experience of working with food, the sensory pleasure of it, the satisfaction of simple tasks done with presence and care. When Liam reopened the restaurant, he made a decision that shocked the food world. He simplified his menu completely. No more architectural presentations or molecular gastronomy techniques. Just simple, seasonal food cooked with attention and care. Roasted fish with lemon, grilled vegetables with good olive oil, pasta with fresh tomatoes and basil, bread baked fresh each day. Some critics were disappointed, calling it a step backward. But something unexpected happened. The restaurant became more popular than ever. Diners reported that the food tasted more alive, more real. They could taste the presence in it, the care, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what was different. Liam knew what was different. He was cooking from no mind now, from the place before thinking arises. His hands knew what to do. His senses knew when something was ready. The thinking mind had finally stepped back and let the deeper intelligence of embodied skill take over. One evening, an old mentor who'd heard about Liam's transformation came to visit. After the meal, he asked what had changed. Liam thought carefully before answering. I realized I'd been cooking from my head, thinking about food instead of just making food. Every dish was an intellectual exercise, a performance, proof of something. But the thinking mind is slow and clumsy compared to the body's wisdom. When I finally got out of my own way and let cooking happen without constant mental interference, everything became easier and better. Not because I developed new techniques, but because I stopped blocking the techniques I already had. His mentor smiled. That's what the old masters understood. Whether it's cooking or painting or archery, the thinking mind can learn the basics. But mastery only comes when thinking stops and the body acts directly, without mental mediation. That's Mushin no mind. What you've discovered isn't a cooking technique. It's a way of being. Let your body breathe on its own now, without trying to control or manage the breath. Notice how it knows exactly what to do, how much air to take in, when to release. This is the intelligence of no mind, the body's wisdom that functions perfectly when the thinking mind doesn't interfere. Can you trust that same wisdom in other areas of your life? Word count to 8. 0, 0, 0. Let your body breathe on its own now, without trying to control or manage the breath. Notice how it knows exactly what to do, how much air to take in, when to release. This is the intelligence of no mind, the body's wisdom that functions perfectly when the thinking mind doesn't interfere. Can you trust that same wisdom in other areas of your life? Liam's transformation reveals something the Zen masters understood deeply. Mastery comes not from thinking more, but from thinking less. The novice needs to think through each step, analyze each decision. But the master has internalized the skill so completely that thinking becomes interference. The greatest performances, whether in cooking, music, sports, or any embodied practice, happen when the thinking mind gets out of the way and lets the body's deeper intelligence take over. This is why Zen training often focuses on simple, repetitive tasks: sweeping, walking, preparing tea. Not because these tasks are inherently spiritual, but because their simplicity makes it easier to notice when the thinking mind is adding unnecessary complexity. When you're just sweeping, there's nothing to analyze or figure out. The broom moves, the floor gets clean. If thinking arises, am I doing this right? Is this the best technique? It's obviously unnecessary. The sweeping was happening perfectly well before those thoughts arose. But we do this with everything. We think about walking while we walk, narrate our experience while we're having it, analyze our feelings while we're feeling them. The thinking mind has become so dominant that we've forgotten how to simply be, how to let life unfold without constant mental mediation. The practice is learning to recognize when thinking is actually needed and when it's just habit, just noise, just the mind's compulsion to stay busy. And gradually, we develop the capacity to let thinking fall away when it's not needed, to rest in no mind, to act directly from a deeper intelligence than thought can access. Yet for some people, the journey to no mind is particularly challenging. Those who have devoted their entire lives to studying consciousness itself, only to realize they've been looking in completely the wrong direction. In the coastal city of Perth, Australia, there was a neuroscientist named David who studied consciousness for a living. His research focused on neural correlates of awareness, trying to map which brain regions activated during different mental states. He'd published dozens of papers, given lectures around the world, built a career on understanding how the brain creates the experience of being conscious. But David's relationship with his own consciousness was entirely intellectual. He knew what fMRI scans showed during meditation. He could describe the neurotransmitter changes associated with flow states. He understood the default mode network and how it related to sense of self. But all of this was knowledge about consciousness, not direct experience of it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He studied awareness professionally, but had never actually investigated his own awareness directly, without the mediating filter of scientific concepts and theories. He'd spent 20 years looking at consciousness from the outside, through brain scans and experimental data, but had never looked at it from the inside, from the first-person perspective of immediate experience. This realization came to him during a particularly frustrating research session. David was analyzing brain scans of experienced meditators, trying to identify the neural signature of what they called pure awareness or witnessing consciousness. The data was complicated, contradictory, refusing to yield clear patterns. And suddenly, sitting in his lab, surrounded by computers and printouts, David thought, I'm trying to find consciousness in brain scans when I'm the consciousness looking at the scans. What if I'm searching in the wrong direction entirely? On impulse, David signed up for a 10-day silent meditation retreat, something he'd always dismissed as unscientific, too subjective, not rigorous enough. But he needed to see what these meditators were experiencing that made them so certain they discovered something real, something that couldn't be captured in brain scans or reduced to neural activity. The retreat center was in the remote outback, hours from any city. The teacher was an Australian woman named Sarah, who'd spent 15 years training in Burma before returning to teach. Unlike the academic meditation researchers David knew, Sarah spoke from direct experience rather than theory. There was something in her presence, a quality of stillness, of being completely at ease, that intrigued him immediately. The first day was brutal for David. 10 hours of sitting meditation with instructions so simple they seemed useless. Just sit. Watch your breath. When your mind wanders, gently return. His scientific mind wanted more detailed technique, clear methodology, measurable outcomes, but Sarah refused to give it. You're trying to make meditation into another research project, she told him during his first interview. Analyzing, measuring, trying to understand, but understanding is just more thinking. Meditation is about seeing what's here before understanding, before concepts, before the thinking mind tries to capture it and turn it into knowledge. David didn't know how to respond. His entire life had been built on understanding through analysis. How could he investigate consciousness without thinking about it? Over the following days, David's thinking mind ran wild. Without his usual outlets, work, reading, conversations, thoughts just circulated endlessly. He analyzed the meditation instructions. He compared his experience to what he knew from research. He created hypotheses about what was supposed to happen. He judged his practice as successful or failing based on whether his mind was quiet. By day 5, David was ready to quit. He'd sat for dozens of hours and achieved nothing. His mind was as noisy as ever, maybe noisier. He felt like a failure at meditation, which was particularly humiliating given his professional expertise in studying it. That evening, he requested an interview with Sarah. I don't think this is working, he told her. My mind won't stop. I've tried everything I know, focusing harder, noting my thoughts, returning to the breath, but nothing changes. I'm clearly not cut out for this. Sarah smiled gently. Tell me when you say your mind won't stop. What exactly won't stop? Thinking. David said, constant thinking, analysis, judgment, planning. It never ends. And who is aware of this thinking? David paused, confused by the question. I am. Yes. But what is this I that's aware of thinking? Is it another thought? David opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. He'd never actually looked at this directly. When he said, I'm aware of my thoughts, who or what was the aware one? Was it just another thought claiming to be the observer, or was there something else? Something that existed prior to and independent of thought? Don't think about it, Sarah said, seeing his mind activating. Just look directly, right now, in this moment. What is aware of the thoughts appearing in your mind? David tried to look, but looking itself felt like thinking. He couldn't find the observer because every time he tried to look at it, he was creating another thought about looking. You won't find it by searching, Sarah said. The aware one can't be found as an object because it's what's looking, not what's being looked at. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The instrument of seeing can't be seen. She leaned forward slightly. Stop trying to find awareness. Just notice that awareness is already here. It's what's hearing these words right now. It's what's been here through all the thinking, all the analyzing, all the trying. It's the constant background that never changes, even though thoughts come and go constantly. Something in David relaxed slightly. He stopped trying to find awareness and just noticed, yes, there was awareness. Of course there was. How could there be any experience at all without awareness? It was so obvious he'd completely overlooked it. Like someone searching everywhere for their glasses while wearing them. That awareness, Sarah continued, is what Zen calls your original nature, your true face. It's not created by thinking. It exists before thought arises, and it's never disturbed by thought. No matter how noisy your mind gets, thoughts come and go in awareness the way clouds come and go in the sky. The sky isn't damaged or diminished by clouds. It just holds them, lets them pass. Word count to 9. 300. Over the remaining days of the retreat, David stopped trying to achieve anything in meditation. He just sat, noticing awareness itself, the unchanging background against which all experience appeared. Sometimes his mind was quiet. More often, it was loud with thoughts. But he began to see that the noise didn't actually touch awareness. Thoughts arose in awareness, played out their drama, and dissolved again, while awareness remained perfectly still, perfectly clear, completely unaffected. On the 8th day, during a particularly deep sitting, David's entire relationship with consciousness shifted. He'd been watching thoughts arise and pass, when suddenly the sense of being someone watching thoughts disappeared. There was no David observing awareness. There was just awareness being aware of itself. No subject, no object, no separation, just pure consciousness, luminous and empty, completely at peace. The experience lasted maybe 30 seconds before the thinking mind rushed back in to claim it, analyze it, try to understand what had just happened. But those 30 seconds changed everything. David had directly experienced what he'd spent 20 years trying to find in brain scans: pure awareness. Consciousness without content. The witnessing presence that exists before and beyond all mental activity. When he returned to his research after the retreat, David's entire approach transformed. He didn't stop studying the neuroscience of consciousness. That work was still valuable. But he understood now that brain scans could only ever show correlates, never the thing itself. Consciousness couldn't be found in neural activity any more than music could be found in the grooves of a record. The brain was the instrument through which consciousness expressed itself. But consciousness itself was something prior, something that couldn't be measured or quantified or reduced to physical processes. He began incorporating first-person phenomenological investigation into his research, teaching his graduate students meditation not as a phenomenon to study, but as a method of direct investigation. He published papers arguing that consciousness science needed to include subjective experience, not as data to be explained away, but as the primary phenomenon to be understood. Some colleagues thought he'd gone soft, abandoned rigorous science for mysticism. But David had found something more valuable than another publication or grant. He'd discovered the difference between knowing about consciousness and knowing consciousness directly, between thinking about awareness and resting as awareness itself. Years later, when asked what meditation had taught him, David would say, "I spent 2 decades searching for consciousness in the brain, measuring and analyzing and theorizing. Then I discovered it was what was doing the searching all along. I was like someone searching everywhere for water while standing in the ocean. Consciousness isn't something you find or achieve. It's what you are before you become anything else. Let your awareness rest in itself now, not going anywhere, not seeking anything. Notice that you don't need to create awareness, it's already here. You don't need to achieve consciousness, you already are consciousness." The thinking mind might arise and say, "I don't understand this," or "I'm not doing it right." But those thoughts are just more content appearing in awareness. Let them come, let them go. Rest as the awareness itself. David's journey from intellectual understanding to direct realization shows us something crucial about no mind. It cannot be grasped by the thinking mind because it's what exists before thinking begins. Every concept we create about it, every theory we develop, every understanding we reach, all of this is still within the realm of thought, still one step removed from the direct experience itself. This is why Zen masters often seem paradoxical or contradictory in their teaching. They're trying to point beyond concepts to something that can only be experienced directly. When a student asks, "What is Buddha nature?" and the master responds, "The cypress tree in the garden," they're not being cryptic for the sake of it. They're trying to interrupt the student's conceptual thinking, to point toward the direct, immediate awareness that exists before the mind labels things as cypress trees or Buddha nature or anything else. The teaching is always the same, whether it comes through meditation, through work, through art, or through any other practice. Stop. Stop thinking about experience and just experience. Stop analyzing awareness and just be aware. Stop trying to understand consciousness and recognize that you are consciousness, looking for itself, always failing, because the seeker and the sought are the same. But sometimes this teaching needs to penetrate our deepest habits, the ways we've structured our entire lives around avoiding the present moment. For those who've spent years running from themselves, no mind arrives not as a gentle recognition, but as an unavoidable confrontation with what can no longer be escaped. And the next story is in the financial district of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. There was a hedge fund manager named Robert who'd built an empire on his ability to process vast amounts of information quickly and make split-second decisions. His mind was his greatest asset, sharp, fast, ruthlessly analytical. He could track dozens of positions simultaneously, spot patterns in market data others missed, stay 3 steps ahead of competitors. But Robert's mental brilliance came at a cost he rarely acknowledged. He slept 4 hours a night, fueled by stress and caffeine. His marriage had ended years ago. His ex-wife said living with him was like living with someone who was never actually present, always calculating, always strategizing. His teenage daughter barely spoke to him anymore, tired of conversations where he was clearly only half listening while the other half of his mind ran through work problems. Robert told himself this was the price of success, that his sacrifices were worth it. He was rich, respected, powerful. What else mattered? The answer came at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, when Robert woke with crushing chest pain and couldn't catch his breath. By the time the ambulance arrived, he was convinced he was dying. The ER doctors ran tests, did scans, monitored him for hours. Finally, the cardiologist delivered the verdict. Not a heart attack. Severe panic attack, triggered by chronic stress and exhaustion. His heart was fine, but if he didn't change something fundamental about how he was living, a real heart attack was probably just a matter of time. Robert was given a prescription for anti-anxiety medication and told to reduce stress, which felt like being told to be taller or have different genes impossible. Not actionable, meaningless. Stress wasn't something he could just decide to have less of. It was woven into every aspect of his life, inseparable from the work that defined him. But the panic attack had shaken him badly. For the first time in his adult life, Robert was genuinely afraid, not of losing money or missing opportunities, but of dying of his body, simply giving out under the relentless pressure he'd been subjecting it to for decades. His doctor mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that some of his patients had found meditation helpful for managing stress. Robert dismissed this. Initially, meditation was for people with too much time on their hands, people who didn't have real responsibilities. But the fear stayed with him, and eventually, desperate enough to try anything, he signed up for an 8-week mindfulness course at a center near his office. The teacher was a soft-spoken man named Thomas, who'd been a corporate lawyer before burning out spectacularly and finding his way to Zen practice. He seemed to understand immediately the kind of people who showed up to his classes: high achievers, stressed professionals, people who approached meditation the same way they approached everything else, as another task to master, another skill to add to their resume. Let me tell you what meditation isn't, Thomas said in the first class. It's not another productivity tool. It's not a technique for becoming a better, more efficient version of yourself. It's not about achieving anything at all. In fact, it's about the opposite: learning to stop achieving, stop striving, stop constantly trying to get somewhere other than where you are. Robert felt immediate resistance. If it wasn't about achieving anything, what was the point? Word count to 10. 400, Thomas continued, seeing the skepticism on several faces. I know what you're thinking. You're busy people. You don't have time for anything that doesn't produce results. But here's what I learned the hard way. Your constant doing, your endless achieving, to your mind that never stops running, that's what's killing you. Not figuratively, literally. Your body is breaking down under the weight of your own thinking mind. He paused, letting this sink in. The practice I'm going to teach you is simple, but not easy. You're going to sit quietly and do nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not achieve mental clarity. Not become more productive. Not fix yourself. Just sit and be present for whatever's happening, without trying to change it or improve it or get anywhere with it. Over the following weeks, Robert discovered just how difficult doing nothing actually was. Sitting still for even 10 minutes felt excruciating. His mind immediately filled with urgent tasks, problems that needed solving, opportunities he might be missing while sitting uselessly on a cushion. His body itched, ached, fidgeted. Everything in him screamed that this was a waste of time. But he kept showing up, partly from fear of another panic attack, and partly from something he couldn't quite name, an exhaustion so deep that even his formidable willpower was beginning to crack. In the 4th week, Thomas taught them about no mind. Your thinking mind is like a radio that's always on, he explained. Even when you're sleeping, it's running in the background, planning, worrying, analyzing. You've been listening to this radio for so long that you think the radio is you. You think you are your thoughts, but you're not. You're the awareness that hears the thoughts, the space in which the radio plays. He guided them through a meditation focused on this recognition. Just sit and notice. Thoughts are happening. Don't try to stop them. Don't engage with them. Just notice them the way you'd notice sounds in the room arising, existing for a moment, then passing away. Robert tried this, and immediately his mind filled with objections. This was too simple. There must be more to it. He was doing it wrong. He wasn't experiencing what he was supposed to experience. On and on the thoughts came, and he realized with growing frustration that he couldn't stop them no matter how hard he tried. Then Thomas said something that cut through all of it. The trying to stop thoughts is itself a thought. You can't think your way to no thought. You can only notice that thoughts are just thoughts. They're not reality. Not you. Not commands you must obey. They're just mental events, like sounds or sensations, arising and passing on their own. Something in Robert shifted. He stopped trying to control his thinking and just watched it happen. A thought about tomorrow's meeting arose. He noticed it. It dissolved. A thought about his daughter arose. He noticed it. It dissolved. A judgment about his meditation practice arose. He noticed it. It dissolved. And in the gaps between thoughts, brief spaces he'd never noticed before, there was just awareness, quiet, still, completely at peace. Not the peace of having solved problems or achieved goals, but the peace that exists when thinking temporarily stops. That night, Robert sat in his apartment longer than the assigned 20 minutes. He just sat, watching his mind, noticing the constant stream of thoughts, and occasionally catching glimpses of the gaps between them, moments of pure awareness without mental content. He wasn't meditating to achieve anything anymore. He was just curious about this strange phenomenon of consciousness observing itself. Over the remaining weeks of the course, Robert's relationship with his thinking mind transformed. He began to see how optional most of his thinking actually was. The constant planning, the endless strategizing, the ruminating over past decisions and future scenarios, 90% of it was just mental habit. The mind's compulsion to stay busy, not actual problem solving. At work, he started experimenting with no mind. When analyzing a potential trade, instead of thinking through every possible scenario, he would look at the data and just no, not through analysis, but through a deeper intelligence that processed information faster than conscious thought. His best decisions, he realized, had always come from this place, quick, intuitive leaps that his thinking mind then justified with analysis after the fact. The real change came in his relationship with his daughter. Robert had spent years having conversations with her while his mind ran elsewhere, half listening while thinking about work. Now, when she spoke, he just listened, not planning his response, not judging what she was saying, not trying to fix her problems, just listening from no mind, completely present. The difference was immediate. "Dad, you're actually here," she said one evening, tears in her eyes. "For the first time in I don't know how long, when I talk to you, I feel like you're actually listening, like I actually matter more than whatever's happening in your head." Robert felt something break open in his chest, not panic this time, but grief. Grief for all the years he'd been absent while physically present. All the moments he'd missed because his thinking mind was somewhere else. But underneath the grief was something else. Gratitude. Gratitude that it wasn't too late, that he could still learn to be present, that his daughter was willing to give him another chance. His meditation practice deepened, not because he was trying harder, but because he'd stopped trying altogether. He would sit each morning, not to achieve anything, not to become calmer or more focused, but simply to practice being present without the filter of thought. Some mornings, his mind was quiet. More often it was loud. But he'd learned that the noise didn't matter. What mattered was the awareness that held the noise, the space that was never disturbed by whatever content moved through it. One morning, 6 months after his panic attack, Robert sat in meditation and experienced something he'd only read about. The sense of being Robert, the separate self, the doer, the one in charge, completely dissolved. There was no one meditating, just meditation happening, just awareness being aware of itself. No subject experiencing an object, no observer watching the observed, just pure presence, thought-free and complete. The experience lasted maybe a minute before the thinking mind reasserted itself. Before Robert reconstituted and claimed the experience, "I just had an experience of no self," but that minute changed everything. Robert had directly tasted what the Zen masters pointed toward, the recognition that we are not the thinker, not the doer, not the separate self we imagine ourselves to be. We are the awareness itself, vast and empty, within which all experience arises and passes. He didn't quit his job or radically change his life. He still worked in finance, still made trades, and still lived in the same apartment. But he was no longer imprisoned by his thinking mind. He could think when thinking was needed, then put thought down when it wasn't. The constant mental noise had quieted, not because thoughts stopped arising, but because he'd stopped identifying with them, stopped believing that every thought required his attention and response. At the end of the 8-week course, Thomas asked each participant to share what they'd learned. When it was Robert's turn, he spoke quietly but clearly. "I spent my whole life believing I was my mind, that my thoughts were who I was. I built everything around maximizing my mental performance, sharpening my thinking, staying ahead, and it almost killed me. What I've learned is that the mind is a tool, brilliant for certain tasks, but disastrous when it never stops running. No mind isn't about destroying the mind or stopping thinking. It's about remembering that you're the awareness that holds thoughts, not the thoughts themselves. And when you remember that, everything changes." Breathe deeply now and notice the quality of awareness that's here, even when thoughts aren't. Between this breath and the next, in that natural pause, There's a gap in thinking, pure presence, just being, without the mental commentary about being. This is your true nature, what you've always been, underneath all the mental noise. Not something to achieve or create, just what's here when you stop long enough to notice it. Robert's transformation shows us that no mind isn't about becoming less capable or abandoning our responsibilities. It's about accessing a deeper intelligence than the thinking mind can reach, an intelligence that processes information instantly, responds to situations appropriately, and acts without the interference of endless mental deliberation. The thinking mind is slow, sequential, limited, but awareness itself is immediate, vast, capable of holding complexity without being overwhelmed by it. This is why athletes describe their peak performances as happening in the zone, a state where thinking stops and the body acts directly, responding to each moment with perfect precision. The basketball player doesn't think about shooting, the shot happens through them. The musician doesn't think about the notes, the music plays itself. This isn't mystical, it's simply what happens when the thinking mind stops interfering with the body's natural intelligence. We all have access to this state, not just in athletic or artistic performance, but in every moment of our lives. The question is whether we can learn to trust it, to let go of the thinking mind's constant management and allow a deeper wisdom to operate. For some, this lesson arrives through the body itself, through practices that demand presence so complete that thinking becomes impossible. In the tech hub of Singapore, there was a software developer named Michelle who spent 12 hours a day in front of screens, her mind constantly engaged in complex problem solving. She was brilliant at her work, could hold entire system architectures in her head, debug code others found impenetrable, see solutions to technical problems that baffled her colleagues. But this same mental intensity that served her professionally had begun to manifest as crippling anxiety and insomnia. Michelle's doctor suggested exercise, so she joined a gym and tried various classes: spinning, yoga, boot camp fitness. But she couldn't stay present for any of them. Her mind would wander to work problems, to code she needed to write, to bugs she needed to fix. She'd finish a workout having barely noticed it, her body moving while her mind was completely elsewhere. Then a colleague mentioned a martial arts dojo near her apartment that taught traditional Aikido. Michelle had never been interested in martial arts. They seemed aggressive and violent, the opposite of her gentle, cerebral nature. But something about the word traditional intrigued her. She imagined it might be meditative, contemplative, something that could quiet her racing mind. The dojo was run by a Japanese sensei named Takahashi, who'd been teaching Aikido for 40 years. The space was simple: traditional tatami mats, wooden floors, a small shrine in one corner. No mirrors, no music, no modern equipment, just empty space and silence. In the first class, Sensei Takahashi demonstrated a basic technique, a simple wrist turn that redirected an opponent's energy. It looked effortless when he did it, like water flowing around a stone. Then he had students pair up and practice. Michelle partnered with another beginner and tried to replicate the movement. But her thinking mind immediately activated. How exactly should her hand grip? What angle should her body turn? How much pressure should she apply? She was trying to understand the technique intellectually, to break it down into components she could analyze and optimize. The result was mechanical, forced, completely ineffective. Her partner barely moved. Sensei Takahashi came over and watched her attempt it again. "Too much thinking," he said simply. "You trying to understand with head. But Aikido is body wisdom, not mind understanding. Watch." He had Michelle grab his wrist, then executed the technique so smoothly and gently that she found herself turning without any sense of being forced. There was no resistance, no conflict, just a natural flow that seemed to require no effort at all. "You feel that?" he asked. "No thinking. Just move with energy, blend with partner, redirect naturally, like river around rock. River doesn't think how to flow, just flows." Michelle tried again, but the moment she attempted to replicate what she'd felt, her thinking mind took over. She was analyzing the sensation, trying to recreate it mentally. And in that analysis, the direct experience was lost. This pattern repeated for weeks. Every technique Sensei Takahashi taught looked simple when demonstrated, but became impossibly complex when Michelle tried to think her way through it. Her mind wanted to understand the mechanics, the principles, the theory. But Aikido, she was discovering, couldn't be understood intellectually. It could only be experienced directly, through the body. Your problem is same problem everyone has at first. Sensei Takahashi told her after a particularly frustrating class. You think you control the technique. You think, I am doing this movement. But in Aikido, there is no I doing, just movement happening through you. When you try to control, you block the natural flow. Must learn to get out of own way. He gestured for her to attack him. Michelle grabbed his wrist and he moved, but so quickly, so seamlessly, that she couldn't follow what he'd done. One moment she was gripping his wrist. The next, she was on the mat, completely unbalanced, with no memory of the transition between. You see? No time for thinking. By the time mind understands what happened, already finished. Aikido happens in gap between thoughts, in space before thinking arises. This is Mushin no mind. What we training? Michelle began to understand that Aikido wasn't really about learning self-defense techniques. It was about training the body to respond without mental interference, to act from a place deeper and faster than thought. Every technique was designed to short-circuit the thinking mind, to force presence so complete that analysis became impossible. Slowly, through months of practice, Michelle began experiencing brief flashes of no mind during training. Her partner would grab her, and before her thinking mind could engage, her body would respond, turning, blending, redirecting. For just a moment, there was no Michelle analyzing what to do, just movement happening, effortless and appropriate. These moments were brief at first, maybe a second or two before the thinking mind rushed back in, but they became more frequent, more recognizable, and they always had the same quality, complete presence. No separation between her and her partner. No time gap between perception and response. Just immediate, appropriate action arising from emptiness. What surprised Michelle most was how this training began affecting her work. She'd always approached coding as a mental activity, something that required constant thinking and analysis. But she started noticing that her best code came in moments of flow, similar to what she experienced in Aikido times when her fingers moved across the keyboard without her conscious direction. When solutions appeared fully formed rather than being constructed piece by piece through analysis, she began cultivating these states deliberately, Instead of thinking through every line of code, she would look at the problem, let her mind become quiet, and then just write. Her hands would move, code would appear, and only afterward would she understand consciously what she'd created. It was faster, more elegant, more creative than her usual analytical approach. Her colleagues noticed the shift. "Your code has changed." One of them said, "It's more. I don't know how to describe it. More fluid somehow. Less mechanical." Michelle knew what had changed. She'd learned to access no mind, to act from the place before thinking, to trust the body's intelligence over the mind's analysis. Not just in Aikido, but in coding, in conversations, in every aspect of life. Word count to 12. 900. One evening after training, Sensei Takahashi invited Michelle to stay for tea. They sat in the small room beside the dojo, and he performed the traditional tea ceremony with the same quality of presence he brought to Aikido. Each movement precise but effortless, completely absorbed in the simple act of preparing and serving tea. "You understand now why we train this way?" he asked, pouring tea into her cup with steady hands. Michelle nodded. "You're not teaching us to fight. You're teaching us to move from no mind." Yes, Aikido is just excuse to practice mushin. Could be tea ceremony. Could be flower arranging. Could be archery. All traditional Japanese arts have same purpose. Train body to act without thinking, mind's interference. Because thinking mind is too slow for real situations. By time you think, should I do this technique or that technique? Moment is already gone. He sipped his tea slowly before continuing. In old days, samurai needed this skill to survive. One moment of thinking in battle could be fatal. But you don't need to be samurai to benefit. Modern life also requires quick response. Your work, you solve complex problems very fast. Yes, yes, Michelle said. You think you solve them with thinking? No, you solve them with no mind. The thinking comes after, to explain what you already knew. The real intelligence is before thought, faster than thought. We're just training you to access that intelligence more reliably. Michelle felt the truth of this in her bones. Her best insights had always come in flashes, complete and whole, before her analytical mind could dissect them. The thinking mind was useful for implementation, for refining ideas, for communicating solutions. But the creative leap itself always came from somewhere deeper. 6 months into her Aikido practice, Michelle experienced what Sensei Takahashi called kensho, a glimpse of one's true nature. It happened during free practice, when students sparred without predetermined techniques. Her partner attacked, and Michelle responded not by choosing a technique and executing it, but by simply moving. There was no Michelle deciding what to do, just pure response. Body and opponent moving together like dancers who'd rehearsed for years. Time seemed to slow down. She could see her partner's intention before the attack fully formed, could respond to energy that hadn't yet manifested as physical movement. Everything was happening in the eternal present moment. No past, no future, no gap between perception and action, just flow. The experience lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it revealed something profound. In that state of complete no mind, there was no fear, no doubt, no self-consciousness, just perfect presence, perfect response, perfect peace. Not because everything was going well, but because there was no separation between Michelle and the experience. She wasn't someone having an experience of Aikido. She was Aikido happening, temporarily free from the illusion of being a separate self, doing the movements. When the session ended and normal consciousness returned, Michelle felt like she'd been given a glimpse behind the curtain of reality. The separate self, Michelle, the coder. Michelle, the anxious overthinker. Michelle, trying to control everything, was just a story, a mental construction. Underneath that story was something much more immediate and real, pure awareness, acting spontaneously, completely free. Her insomnia disappeared shortly after this experience. Not because she'd learned relaxation techniques or stress management, but because she'd stopped being at war with her own mind. When thoughts arose at night, she didn't fight them or try to suppress them. She just noticed them from the space of no mind, let them pass, and rested in the awareness that was undisturbed by whatever content moved through it. Years later, Michelle would tell new students at the dojo, "I came here thinking I'd learn self-defense. What I actually learned was that the self I was defending didn't really exist. The me that worries and plans and tries to control everything that's just thinking. Just mental activity. The real me, the true nature underneath all that, is the awareness that exists before thought arises. And when you touch that, even briefly, everything changes. Not because your circumstances improve, but because you realize you were never trapped by them in the first place. Let your body settle now into complete relaxation. Notice how when you're not thinking about your body, it knows exactly what to do, how to breathe, how to digest, how to heal, how to rest. This is the wisdom of no mind, the intelligence that existed before you learned language, before you developed a sense of separate self. Can you trust it? Can you let go and rest in the body's natural knowing? Michelle's journey through Aikido reveals something essential. No mind isn't just a mental state. It's embodied wisdom, the intelligence that flows through us when we stop interfering with it through constant thinking and controlling. Every traditional practice, martial arts, tea ceremony, calligraphy, archery, was designed to cultivate this capacity, to train us to act from presence rather than from the thinking mind's endless analysis and hesitation. But this same teaching can arrive through any activity where we're forced to be so completely present that thinking becomes impossible, where the demand of the moment is so immediate that only direct response will do. The path to no mind sometimes opens for those who've structured their entire identity around being helpful, around solving everyone else's problems while avoiding their own inner emptiness. In the university town of Cambridge, England, UK, there was a therapist named Sarah who'd spent 25 years helping others navigate their psychological struggles. She was deeply skilled, genuinely compassionate, known for her ability to hold space for people's pain without trying to fix it prematurely. Her practice was always full, her reputation stellar, but Sarah had a secret she barely acknowledged even to herself. She was using her work as a way to avoid her own inner life. As long as she was focused on other people's problems, she didn't have to face the growing emptiness she felt when alone. The sense that underneath her professional competence was a void she'd been running from for decades. Her wake-up call came during a supervision session with an older colleague named Margaret. Sarah was presenting a difficult case, describing her interventions with characteristic insight and care. Margaret listened quietly, then asked a question that stopped Sarah cold. "Why are you so afraid of silence?" Sarah started to defend herself. She wasn't afraid of silence. She used silence therapeutically all the time, but Margaret interrupted gently. Not silence in your sessions. Silence in yourself. I've known you for 15 years, Sarah, and I've never once seen you just be. You're always doing something, helping someone, processing something. What are you afraid you'll find if you actually stop? The question pierced through Sarah's defenses. She felt tears rising, a grief she couldn't quite name. What was she avoiding? What was she running from? That evening, unable to shake Margaret's question, Sarah did something she almost never did. She sat in her apartment with nothing to do. No book to read. No case notes to review. No friends to call. Just sitting, with only her own company. The discomfort was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, her mind was generating urgent tasks, emails that needed responses, calls she should make, articles she ought to read. The impulse to do something, anything, was almost unbearable. But she forced herself to stay still, to resist the compulsion, to fill the emptiness with activity. And in that forced stillness, Sarah began to see what she'd been running from, a deep, aching loneliness. Not loneliness for other people. She had friends, colleagues, clients, but loneliness for herself, for genuine contact with her own being underneath all the roles and competencies and helpful personas. She'd spent her entire adult life being the helper, the listener, the one who held space for others. But who was she when she wasn't performing that role, when there was no one to help, no problem to solve, no distress to alleviate? The question terrified her because she genuinely didn't know the answer. Sarah began sitting in silence every evening, not as a therapeutic technique, but as a confrontation with herself. The first weeks were excruciating. Her mind filled with thoughts about everything she should be doing. Instead, she'd check her watch every few minutes, convinced hours had passed when only 5 minutes had elapsed. The emptiness she'd been avoiding felt enormous, threatening to swallow her whole. But she kept sitting, and gradually, something began to shift. The thoughts still came urgent, demanding, trying to pull her back into activity. But she started noticing something underneath the thoughts, a quality of awareness that was present even when thinking wasn't, a silence that existed before thoughts arose to fill it. One evening, about a month into this practice, Sarah experienced a moment of complete no-mind. She was sitting, watching thoughts arise and pass, when suddenly the watcher disappeared. There was no Sarah observing her mind, just awareness being aware of itself. No separation between observer and observed, just pure presence, vast and empty and completely at peace. The moment lasted only a few seconds before her thinking mind rushed back in with commentary. What was that? Was that enlightenment? How do I get back to it? But those few seconds revealed something profound. The emptiness she'd been running from wasn't empty in the sense of lacking or deficient. It was empty in the sense of spacious, open, free from content. And it wasn't something to fear, but something to rest in. Like finally coming home after years of wandering. Sarah's therapy practice changed after this experience. Not in obvious ways, she still used the same skills, the same interventions, the same compassionate presence. But there was a quality of genuineness that hadn't been there before. She could sit with clients' pain without needing to fix it because she'd learned to sit with her own emptiness without needing to fill it. She was no longer using her clients to avoid herself. She could be truly present for them because she'd learned to be present for herself. to meet the silence within without terror, to rest in no mind without constantly generating mental activity to avoid it. One of her long-term clients noticed the change. "You're different," the woman said. "I can't put my finger on it exactly, but when I talk now, I feel like you're really here. Before, I always had this sense that you were performing, being a therapist. Now you just are." Sarah knew what she meant. She'd stopped performing. She'd stopped using her professional identity as a shield against genuine presence. The silence she'd been avoiding turned out to be the very ground of authentic connection, not empty absence. But the fullness of presence before thought claims it and turns it into something else. Years later, when training new therapists, Sarah would say, "The most important thing you can bring to this work isn't technique or theory or even compassion. It's the capacity to be genuinely present without needing to fill the silence with helping or fixing or knowing. Your clients don't need you to have all the answers. They need you to be empty enough that they can find their own answers in the space you hold. And you can only hold that space if you've learned to be comfortable in your own emptiness, your own no mind." Soften your breathing now, letting it become quiet and gentle. Notice the silence between breaths, the pause before the next inhale begins. That silence isn't empty, it's full of potential, full of presence. It's the ground from which all experience arises and to which all experience returns. Can you rest there? Can you let yourself be held by that silence instead of constantly filling it with thinking? Sarah's discovery shows us that no mind isn't about achieving some special state of consciousness. It's about finally stopping our flight from the present moment, ceasing our constant mental activity that keeps us perpetually one step removed from direct experience. We fill the silence with thinking, with doing, with helping, with any activity that prevents us from encountering what's actually here when we stop. But what's actually here, when we finally have the courage to stop and look, isn't the terrifying void we imagined. It's the vast spaciousness of awareness itself, peaceful and complete, not lacking anything, not needing anything, just being what it already is. This teaching often comes most powerfully to those in helping professions, those who've made their identity around being useful, around having answers, around solving problems. When they finally stop and meet their own inner silence, they discover the paradox. Genuine helping comes not from having all the answers, but from being empty enough to make space for others to find their own wisdom. Next is our last story tonight, before we say goodbye and have a deep sleep. This understanding arrives for those who've built their lives around certainty, around knowing, around having answers, only to discover that true wisdom lives in the space of not knowing. There was a philosophy professor named Callum in the academic halls of Edinburgh, Scotland, UK. He'd spent 35 years teaching epistemology, the study of knowledge itself. He could argue any position brilliantly, demolish weak reasoning with surgical precision, to trace the history of ideas through centuries of thought. His mind was a vast repository of philosophical frameworks, theories, counter-arguments. But Callum had begun to notice something troubling. The more he knew about knowledge, the less he actually understood anything directly. Every experience was immediately filtered through conceptual frameworks. He couldn't look at a tree without thinking about phenomenology, couldn't have a conversation without analyzing the logic of arguments, couldn't experience anything without the thinking mind immediately classifying, categorizing, contextualizing. The crisis came during a lecture on Zen Buddhism's concept of beginner's mind. Callum was explaining to his students how Zen practitioners cultivate a state of openness and fresh perception, free from preconceptions and accumulated knowledge. He quoted Shunryu Suzuki, "In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind, there are few." A student raised her hand. "Professor, do you have beginner's mind?" The question stopped Callum cold. Did he? When was the last time he'd looked at anything with fresh eyes? Without the overlay of everything he knew? When had he last experienced something directly, rather than through the lens of accumulated knowledge? No, he admitted honestly. "I don't think I do." "Then how can you teach us about it?" the student asked. Not disrespectfully, but with genuine curiosity. Callum had no answer. The rest of the lecture felt hollow, performative. He was teaching concepts about direct experience while having no direct experience himself. Just more concepts, about concepts, about concepts. That evening, Callum did something he'd never done in his academic career. He sat in his office and admitted to himself that he didn't actually know anything. Not in the sense of direct, immediate knowing. He knew about things, had theories about things, could explain things brilliantly. But the actual thing itself, reality prior to conceptual overlay, he'd lost complete contact with it. That evening, Callum did something he'd never done in his academic career. He sat in his office and admitted to himself that he didn't actually know anything. Not in the sense of direct, immediate knowing. He knew about things, had theories about things, could explain things brilliantly. But the actual thing itself, reality prior to conceptual overlay, he'd lost complete contact with it. On impulse, Callum searched for Zen centers in Edinburgh and found a small sitting group that met 3 evenings a week. The teacher was a Scottish woman named Morag, who'd trained in Korea for a decade before returning home. When Callum contacted her, explaining he was a philosophy professor interested in exploring Zen practice, she responded with a single line, "Leave your philosophy at the door." The first evening, Callum arrived at the small converted warehouse where the group met. About a dozen people sat on cushions arranged in a circle. Morag was at the front, a woman in her 50s with short grey hair and remarkably still presence. "We sit for 40 minutes," she said simply. "No guided meditation. No instructions beyond. Sit upright. Breathe naturally. And when thoughts arise, neither follow them nor push them away. Just sit." Callum had expected more, some teaching, some framework, some methodology. But Morag rang a bell and everyone simply sat. The room fell silent except for occasional traffic sounds from outside. Callum's mind immediately activated. What was he supposed to be doing? Was there a technique he should know? How would he know if he was doing it correctly? His thinking mind, deprived of philosophical problems to solve, began generating them. What is the relationship between Zen practice and phenomenology? How does this compare to Husserl's epoche? Is this consistent with Heidegger's concept of 40 minutes passed in this mental chaos? When the bell rang, Callum felt frustrated and slightly foolish. He'd sat for nearly an hour and achieved nothing but more thinking. After the sitting, Morag asked if anyone had questions. Callum raised his hand. "I found it very difficult to stop thinking. My mind was constantly active. Is there a technique for quieting it?" Morag looked at him with eyes that seemed both kind and penetrating. "What's your occupation?" "I'm a philosophy professor." She smiled slightly. "Ah, so you've spent your whole life training your mind to think constantly. and now you want it to stop on command. That's like asking a marathon runner to suddenly stand completely still. The mind will keep running because that's what you've trained it to do. So how do I untrain it? You don't. That's still the thinking mind's approach. Identify the problem. Develop a solution. Implement a technique. Zen is not about fixing or improving or achieving anything. It's about seeing through the illusion that there's a separate you who needs to control the mind. She leaned forward slightly. Tell me when you're thinking. Who is aware of the thoughts? Callum started to answer, then paused. Who was aware? The obvious answer was, I am. But when he looked for this I that was aware, he couldn't find it as a separate entity. There were just thoughts arising, and awareness of thoughts arising, but no clear boundary between the aware one and what was being aware of. Don't think about it, Morag said, reading his expression. Just notice directly. Right now, thoughts are happening. Awareness of thoughts is happening. Is there a separate you standing apart from this process? Or is there just experiencing itself? Over the following weeks, Callum kept returning to the sitting group. Each session was the same 40 minutes of sitting, his mind racing with thoughts, followed by Morag's simple but penetrating questions that undermined his conceptual understanding without offering anything to replace it. Gradually, Callum began to see the pattern. Every time his mind generated a question or problem, he would immediately try to solve it through thinking. How do I achieve no mind? The thinking mind would generate theories, strategies, techniques. But all of that was still thinking. Still the mind, trying to use thinking to transcend thinking, which was impossible. Like trying to see your own face without a mirror. One evening, during sitting practice, Callum experienced something that shifted his entire understanding. A thought arose, something about a paper he needed to write. Normally, his mind would grab that thought and run with it, planning the paper, analyzing arguments, constructing paragraphs. But this time, he caught it at the moment of arising. He watched the thought form, exist for a brief moment, and then dissolve back into emptiness. And in that moment of watching, there was no Callum analyzing the thought, just awareness, witnessing the thought arise and pass away without engaging with it. No thinker separate from the thinking, just the process itself, happening in consciousness. The recognition lasted only a few seconds before his thinking mind rushed back in to claim the experience. That was it. That was no mind. How do I get back to it? But those few seconds had shown him something crucial. The separate self. He thought he was Callum the philosopher, Callum the expert. Callum, who knew so much, was itself just a thought. A very persistent, constantly reinforced thought, but still just a mental construction, not a solid, permanent entity. He began to see that all his philosophical knowledge, all his accumulated learning, was like a screen between himself and direct experience. He couldn't look at anything without his mind immediately overlaying it with concepts, theories, frameworks. A sunset wasn't just a sunset, it was phenomenological experience, aesthetic judgment, philosophical questions about perception and reality. He'd become so skilled at thinking about things that he'd completely lost the ability to simply be with things. Morag noticed the shift. After one sitting, she approached him. "Something's changed," she said. "I had a moment where I saw that the thinker is just another thought," Callum said. "Not a permanent entity, but just a mental pattern that arises and passes." "Yes, And now you think you understand." She smiled slightly. "But understanding is still thinking. The real question is, can you live from what you saw? Can you function in your daily life teaching, writing, all of it, while knowing that the one doing it is just a useful fiction, not a solid reality?" Over the following months, Callum's entire approach to philosophy transformed. He still taught, still read, still thought rigorously, but he no longer identified with the thinker. Thoughts arose when needed, served their purpose, and dissolved again. The thinking mind was a tool he could pick up and put down, not a constant companion that ran 24/7. His lectures changed in quality. Instead of delivering polished presentations where he demonstrated his expertise, he began teaching from a place of genuine inquiry. He would pose questions and actually sit with the not knowing, letting the space of uncertainty exist without rushing to fill it with answers. Students noticed immediately, "Your classes feel different this term," one said. "More alive somehow, like we're actually exploring together rather than you just telling us what you know." Callum understood what had changed. He'd stopped performing knowledge and started embodying inquiry. The expert mind, which always had answers, always knew the next step had given way to beginner's mind, which could meet each question freshly, without the weight of accumulated knowing. One afternoon, Callum was walking through the meadows, a park near the university, when he experienced what Zen calls kensho, a sudden glimpse of one's true nature. He wasn't meditating or practicing. He was just walking, watching the afternoon light filter through trees, when suddenly the separation between walker and walking dissolved. There was no Callum experiencing the walk, just walking happening, just seeing happening, just being happening, without anyone doing the being. The experience lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but in those 30 seconds, the entire world was completely different. Everything was vivid, immediate, seen for the first time. The trees weren't concepts called trees, they were just this, just what was appearing, indescribable and perfect. No thinking about what he was seeing, no analyzing or categorizing, just pure, direct experiencing before the mind labeled anything. When normal consciousness returned, when the sense of being Callum reconstituted itself, he understood what the Zen masters meant when they said, "Enlightenment is seeing your original face, the face you had before your parents were born." It wasn't a metaphor. It was literally the consciousness that exists before we overlay it with concepts of self and other. Before we create the story of being a separate person, having experiences. Callum continued teaching philosophy for many more years, but his relationship to knowledge had fundamentally changed. He no longer clung to knowing, no longer needed to have answers, no longer felt threatened by uncertainty. The vast repository of knowledge in his mind was still there, still accessible when needed, but it no longer defined him. When other academics asked about his transformation, he would say, "I spent 3 decades accumulating knowledge, becoming an expert, filling my mind with frameworks and theories. Then I discovered that real wisdom isn't about knowing more, it's about being willing to not know, to meet reality directly before the thinking mind labels it and turns it into concepts." Beginner's mind isn't ignorance. It's the freedom to see things freshly, without the burden of everything we think we know. Breathe gently now, and notice how each moment arrives completely new, unprecedented, never experienced before in exactly this way. The thinking mind wants to label it, categorize it, relate it to past moments. But before that labeling happens, there's just raw presence. Just this, just now. Can you rest in that immediacy, even briefly, before thought claims it? Callum's journey shows us that expertise itself can become a prison. That the more we know about something, the harder it becomes to actually see it directly. This is why Zen emphasizes don't know mind not as ignorance or lack of learning, but as the capacity to meet each moment without the filter of accumulated knowledge, to see freshly rather than through the lens of what we already believe we understand. The wisdom of no mind isn't found in books or theories. It's found in the willingness to not know, to be uncertain, to meet life's questions with openness rather than rushing to fill them with answers. Breathe slowly now, and let us gather the threads of wisdom we've woven through all these stories tonight. Michael discovered that the trying itself was the problem, that peace comes not from stopping thoughts, but from stopping the war with thoughts. Sophie learned that creativity flows when the thinking mind steps aside and lets the body's deeper intelligence move the brush. William spent decades studying consciousness, only to discover it was what was doing the studying all along, not something to find, but what we already are. James found that his brilliant mind, which served him so well professionally, had imprisoned him in constant thinking until he learned to rest in the gaps between thoughts. Liam's hands knew how to cook without his mind's interference, the intelligence of no mind that acts perfectly when thinking stops directing. David searched for awareness in brain scans, while being the awareness that was searching the seeker, and the sought always the same. Robert's panic attack forced him to stop running. And in that stopping, he discovered that awareness exists peacefully underneath all the mental chaos. Michelle's Aikido training taught her body to respond before thought could interfere, revealing the intelligence that lives in presence, not analysis. Sarah spent years helping others while avoiding her own inner silence, only to discover that silence wasn't empty, it was the fullness of presence itself. Callum accumulated 3 decades of philosophical knowledge before learning that wisdom lives in beginner's mind, in the willingness to not know, to see freshly. All of them discovered the same truth. We are not our thoughts. We are the awareness in which thoughts appear and disappear. The silence that holds all sound. The spaciousness that exists before thinking begins. This no mind is not something distant or difficult to find. It's here right now, closer than your breath, more intimate than your heartbeat. It's what's reading these words. It's what's been listening all along. Not something you need to achieve or create, just what you already are when the thinking mind finally rests. Let your whole body soften now, releasing into complete rest. Your mind has been working so hard for so long, thinking, analyzing, planning, worrying. Let it finally stop. Not because you're forcing it to stop, but because you're allowing it to rest. The way you'd allow a tired child to finally sleep. Notice the silence underneath all the mental noise. Notice the awareness that's been here all along, witnessing every thought, every sensation, every breath. You are that awareness, not the thoughts, not the stories, not the endless mental commentary. You are the vast, open space in which all of that arises and passes away. Rest there. You are home. You always were. May these teachings dissolve into your being like salt into water, not as concepts to remember, but as the living recognition of what you already are. May you sleep deeply in the silence of no mind. May you wake knowing the peace that exists before thought, the awareness that is your true nature. May you carry this recognition lightly through all your days, not as knowledge to grasp, but as the simple truth of being. Nothing to achieve, nowhere to go, no one to become. Just this, just now, just being. Perfect, complete, whole. Rest now, let go. You are held by awareness itself, by the vast silence that has always been here, that will always be here. That is what you truly are beneath all the thinking, all the doing, all the endless mental activity. Peace, silence, no mind, home.